And you have two options here. Either the fully anti-spiritual, anti-religious, or anti-metaphysical notion. In other words, the fully materialistic reductionist notion. And if you use that and you reject religion, well, you already got the point. What you're left with is biology. If you want to take the other way, so well, it's not just about biology, it's not just about reductions to matter. We also have, minds and society and soul and spirit. So for instance, in the Far East, in the Eastern philosophy, everything is more tolerant, not like in our West, as heirs of this repressive monotheistic culture. Well, you might be surprised. You might just want to study Eastern philosophies a little more, especially Buddhism. For instance, one of the argument that have been made is that, first of all, there are certain geocultural areas, countries where there's a definitely higher incidence for certain disorder of sexual development, and I mentioned the 5-alpha-2 reductase deficiency, and we can find a higher rate that in countries such as Egypt, Turkey, the Dominican Republic, for instance. The Dominican Republic, by the way, country where the oldest American university was built, the Aquinas in Santo Domingo. That aside, there seemed to be a very high prevalence of 5-alpha reductase deficiency in those countries, and another country where similar situations, both in terms of genetic prevalence as well as overall understanding, is in Thailand. Now, from a biological standpoint, we know the answer. Most of these issues have to do, maybe you cannot push it fully through 100% causal factors, simply because you cannot apply the case control side. You cannot go back and verify what would have happened if you have a similar genetic situation. But a fairly precise assumption is to make that this has to do with a smaller genetic pool. So consanguinity in breeding that causes 5-alpha reductase deficiency, which in turn, as I mentioned, makes the person switch around the age of 12, and that's how they define them in the Dominican Republic in Spanish, and they switch from female to male, and usually behave as men afterward because of the mutation, the SRD5A2 gene. So in any case, if you think about Buddhism, of course, when an example, I think it's done within Thailand in the Katu group, which we could identify as individuals affected by DSD, and individuals that might present with the opposite sex that are born with, not assigned with. Okay, sex is not something you assign. Nature assigns sex to you, not the doctor. The argument is made is that, well, you're born this way. It's not a question of preference or what's fashionable. It's not being like cool at this point. Okay. Which again, it's an oxymoron, because on one side, the argument is made that anybody could call themselves, in this case, a woman, despite the fact that there's no biological element. It's just the way you feel. It's prescriptive. It's self-identification. And yet at the same time, the argument is made, no, you're born this way. Well, okay, how about we separate homosexual elements and lesbian elements to a different extent, though, generally speaking, from transgender and non-binary issues. But if you do that, it still doesn't make sense to put everything in the same basket with LGBTQIA plus. So it's in itself an oxymoron. It doesn't matter which direction you take. It's still wrong. You're still making a mistake, a cognitive mistake. But if you could put it in the same basket for the sake of, again, a prescriptive moral element in order to promote love, care, and inclusion, you will still make a cognitive mistake. What is this cognitive mistake? To claim that a person is born this way would actually make sense, well, not necessarily in the 5-alpha-2 reductase deficiency, because there is a switch around the age of 12 or so, but in other elements, the claim is that you're not making stuff up. There is something physically present in your body at the level of chromosome, or gonads, or hormones, genitalia, etc. The claim indicates that you're not a quote-unquote fully stereotypical woman, fully stereotypical man. So it's not a question of what's fashionable, what's cool. You're born this way. And that's the claim it's made on the left side of the political spectrum. And yet, according to Stern Buddhist teaching, what happens to the Katu group it's due to karma. So yes, there is less of a negative judgment. There's certainly not a blame because the person is not responsible for being born that way. And yet, according to karma, something bad happened in the previous reincarnation. So this moralizing element, if we want to call it moralizing, it's not prevalent only, as the claim is made, in current monotheistic culture, but also in many other cultures anyway. And again, this is not a question of judging as in being violent or disrespectful, but we have to acknowledge the very problematic and possibly life-threatening issues with small genetic pools. By the way, it's not true to say that this was not the case in Europe. If you really think about most royal families in Europe, having a smaller genetic pool was actually considered to be a good thing. You're having a royal blood, right? You're a blue-blooded individual. But that's, from a biological standpoint, already well known to create not just an Habsburg aesthetic, right? I'm from Tyrol, so I'm very fond of our Habsburg heritage, including our Maximilian first emperor in Mexico heritage. But nevertheless, small genetic pools comes with a lot of truly detrimental issues, infertility, and a variety of psychomotor and genetic malfunctions. So all things considered, this is an indication to conclude, because I want to be mindful of the time, that transgender ideology is extremely dangerous. It's entirely anti-scientific. At this point, I cannot make the claims ascientific or unscientific, as in either ignoring science or not knowing enough about science. Is anti-science. And the issue is that most of the people that don't have proper scientific understanding, that support that, do that for the right reasons, because they have love in their heart, they have appreciation for diversity in their heart. But this ultimately destroys the very thing we want to support. Let us therefore examine the content. Again, not all of it, but selected sentences from each book, with our best efforts not to be biased in any way in the selected process. The first book they read, I Am Jazz. In our judgment, the ethical premise of the book is to narrate the story of a child from a healthy perspective of love, self-discovery, acceptance, tolerance, and a proper fight against stereotypes which could be potentially harmful to a healthy development. Of course, we do agree with these premises. However, already in the first page of the book, the author quotes a child saying, "For as long as I can remember, my favorite color has been pink." If the intent of the book is to question certain gender stereotyping attitudes, certainly what in the US, not necessarily in the rest of America, and certainly not in the rest of the world, is usually perceived as feminine, the color pink, might miss the point. Of course, the child is free to express whatever he or she feels is appropriate, and we should encourage this self-exploration. Unless, of course, our quote-unquote socially constructed assumption that pink is for girls only becomes an etiological factor in any clinical decision-making process to determine the sex of the child, not because of an intrinsically faulty methodology, but because we would be dealing with circular pseudo-deductive thinking. This is possibly the central issue in all the books, presenting a decision of accepting versus rejecting a child's perception, definition, ideation, or identity of self solely based on perceptual narratives from the child, without any references to the normally, i.e. scientifically based norms to clinically make a judgment of this nature occurring process. Itself predicated on examination of the tetrad chromosomes, gonads, hormones, genitalia, to which we should add, from a biological standpoint, both the examination of neurotransmitters, themselves linked to the previous examination of hormones, and through the mutual biochemical influence of nervous system versus endocrine system through pituitary gland and hypothalamic processes, and the examination of neuroanatomical and neurofunctional elements, such as right versus left hemisphere distribution, cortical versus limbic activation, predominant and context-related, and cognitive-emotional selective preferences on a binary distribution. Attacking the application of these processes as biologistic, as opposed to biologist-informed or biology-based, is both incorrect and misrepresenting the scope and underlying mechanisms contained therein. As we claim throughout this message, we would certainly not expect a children's book to delve into the intricacies of electrobiochemical processes. However, to present a situation of parents simply deciding to accept or reject these type of claims from a child simply based on what the book describes as an open, non-judgmental, caring attitude, as opposed to a sound clinical and scientific judgment based on solid research examination, is not only unhelpful to child, it can be extremely dangerous. To continue with our analysis, the sentence above, it has, for as long as I can remember, is just an example, of course, and despite the fact that it's already concerning that this faulty deductive process is displayed in the first page, it is further corroborated, in a negative sense, by similar statements in the following pages, as in, here are some of my other favorite things: dancing, singing, backflips, drawing, soccer, swimming, makeup, and pretending I'm a pop star. Furthermore, there's another questionable cognitive merging, i.e. the idea, ethically acceptable, of allowing a child to dream, explore, and develop in a non-judgmental way, with a confusion, in a strictly etymological and clinical sense, of merging together, or more specifically, melting, pouring, or spilling together, in the child and of the child. The logical sequence does see the subject of the experience described as both displaying behavior that are deemed, both by the author and by the possibly inattentive reader, empirically verifiable, or at least being aesthetically, perceptually visible data, for instance dancing and makeup, with a neurodevelopment, emotional, cognitive, and behavior striving toward the poetic, again etymologically intended, thus creative, rehearsal and training toward the future, for instance pretending I am a pop star. These aspects are in themselves very problematic, as they present a situation which the author, not specifically the author of this book, but any author who could fall prey of these logical fallacies, literally, confuses the logical premises and the deductive conclusion drawn thereby. This is unfortunately a very common issue in the application of the scientific method. As scientists, we are less prone to have some confirmation bias. In fact, as the literature indicates, we might just be better at cherry-picking results which will fit our worldview, but one would hope that the peer-reviewed process and evidence from meta-analysis, or at the very least solid study design such as triple-blind randomized case-controlled studies, could help distinguish evidence-based facts from incorrect assumptions and interpretations. Moreover, we also want to point out the intrinsically incorrect assumption that there should be a disagreement or even an opposition between parents and scientists or clinicians. An example of this is found a few pages later. At first, my family was confused. They always thought of me as a boy. This is an extremely problematic statement. Talking about my practice and teaching, specifically when I meet with the family members of my patients, I refrain from making any assumptions of incorrectness in the way the parents, in general their mothers, simply due to statistically relevant factors according to which they are minor, often the ones discussing their children with the doctor, understand their children. In which they are more often the ones discussing their children with the doctor. In other words, and at the risk of sounding too simplistic, as in bumper sticker messages, moms know best, moms know what's best for their children. I'm not saying this to just sound nurturing and appealing to the crowd. I'm saying this because that is what both the scientific literature and common sense clearly say. Of course, in cases such as difficult and problematic upbringing, trauma-related and or provoking experiences, verbal, physical, psychological, emotional, or sexual abuse, a clinician couldn't and shouldn't assume that parents are always right, as in clinically correct, about their child, as both their perception and parenting skills might negatively affect by this. But a well-informed clinician should never assume, even in these cases, that the traumatic experiences themselves always delete any healthy parenting instincts in full. To be clear, in saying this, we are simply emphasizing how, in the absence of any other parameters, when both science and parental instincts agree, there should be very little room for a level of doubt which could be extremely detrimental for the proper development of the child. But what about problematic issues raised by, permit me to term in this context, an extremist, intolerant, hyper-religious mentality at the basis of very poor decision from parents, which will ultimately harm their child? Should science and medicine speak against this as well in order to promote empathy, tolerance, and inclusion? Yes, of course. The process is exactly the same. The initial premise, clearly demonstrated by the scientific literature, is that more often than not, healthy, in this context read as clinical issues trauma-free, parents know what's best for their children, at least in such early developmental stages. Given my specific background, I would strongly emphasize how this should, generally speaking, be the rule, until the proper development of the child's prefrontal cortex, and more generally, of the child's neuroanatomical structure, i.e. not before the age of 19 on statistical average with a sex-specific difference of the value of plus or minus 1 with a margin of error of 0.5. So what if the parents' so-called intolerant perspectives are in conflict with science? Well, we could certainly agree with what the Thomistic literature had to say for centuries now about this. If there is a clash between your religion and your science, one of two cases is under scrutiny. Either your way of interpreting religion is wrong, or your way of interpreting science is. To use an example regarding this issue, a few pages later, the book reads, "I hardly ever play with trucks or tools or superheroes, only princesses and mermaid costumes. My brother told me this was girl stuff." From a logical standpoint, this could be indicative of a variety of premises and causes. We could at least list a few. The child, Jazz in this case, is indeed a girl, and further psychological, psychotherapeutic, social cultural, clinical pharmacological, medical surgical help in this very order might be needed. This could be extremely hard on parents who might feel discouraged, shocked, helpless in figuring out how to best help their children. But pretending that medical conditions beyond body dysphoria and body dysmorphia, just to name a few, this is certainly not a place where to discuss the clinical details around activation or lack thereof of the SRI genes or about DSDs, such as CAS, 5-RRD, OD, MRKH, Turner, Klinefelter syndrome, to talk about karyotype analysis, etc., are not true, is both unscientific and evil, with extremely detrimental effects on all children and adults suffering from it. This cannot and should not be ignored, ever. Of course, this interpretation is what is presented in the book. It could be true, but a cognitive logical deductive process in terms of taxological and decision-making steps and processes to reach this clinical conclusion is completely ignored in the book. Of course, this book tells a story and it's not meant to be used and or viewed as a diagnostic manual. Making clinical diagnosis in areas at the intersection between mental and physical, although the vast majority of clinical causes could present a psychosomatic component, is extremely difficult. And that's precisely why the manuals we use in clinical setting is called a diagnostic and statistical, that's neither etiological nor ontological, manual of mental disorders, DSM. However, our concern with utilization of this book in class is predicated upon the fact that without proper clinical and scientific training, which takes several years, not a few hours per semester, and delivered to fully formed, neuroanatomically functional adults and not in children, books like this could be misinterpreted by loving, well-meaning, open-minded, but madly scientifically untrained, uninformed, or misinformed parents who might cause very serious damage to their children. The child, Jazz in this case, likes both trucks and mermaid costumes. No further interpretation, read pseudo-psychoanalytical inquiry, is needed. While this type of behavior is statistically uncommon, i.e. boys tend to play with trucks more than girls do, and conversely girls tend to play with mermaid costumes more than boys do, even when accounting for variables on the level of upbringing, education, sociocultural and or ethno-religious factors, boys can play with mermaid costumes and girls can play with trucks. This is healthy and should be welcome as part of an appropriate development. To claim that only boys could, and even more concerningly should play with trucks, and vice versa in the case of girls, is an attack to the healthy development of the child. It is unscientific and dangerous. Just as anti-scientific and dangerous the claim that playing with trucks makes a girl automatically become a boy. The child's brothers told her that this was girl stuff because that's a general assumption. An assumption, as evidenced by the consideration above, fully grounded in both science and empirical observation, both subjective and personal and cultural, social, and experience. Again, no further interpretation needed. D. The child brothers told her that this was girl stuff, but did so in order to provoke and or offend Jazz. Certainly a possibility. Read any scientific paper in the area, or much better, literally ask any parents of siblings, and you'll find out that, yes, siblings provoke and offend each other. In no way this behavior is indicative of the fact that Jazz was not a boy and is a girl instead. E. The child brothers told her that this was girl stuff, but did not so in order to provoke and or offend Jazz. Jazz's perception of this was incorrect. This does not make the child physically or psychologically ill. It is just a question of inappropriate interpretation of behavior and emotion, both internally and externally, as multiple fMRI studies and the literature in general indicate. Similar arguments could be made about many other sentences in the book. For instance, whenever we went out, I had to put on my boy clothes again. This made me mad. It could be what the child actually says it is. The child does not want to put on boy clothes again. Any further interpretation, besides what is commonly perceived as a very common behavior in children in general, at this developmental stage, it is not well-founded at this level. We could do the same analysis for this and the following books, but this letter will become extremely long and we certainly don't want to abuse your patience, so we only address some aspects of the following two books, without examining too many details. In any case, and as previously stated, we welcome any further conversation. Book 2, A Boy Named Penelope. This book presents similar logical fallacies, circular thinking, and misinterpreted or misconstructed assumptions. To quote just a few, we can start with the very first sentence of the book. I'm no ordinary kid, I'm a ninja. Again, another example of questionable cognitive merging of dreaming, exploring, and developing in a non-judgmental way, with confusing messages. As in the previous book, this logical sequence that sees the subject of the experience described as both displaying behaviors that are deemed empirically verifiable/visible, for instance, the fact that ninjas are strong and smart, and the tautological claim that ninjas have ninjas' names, with the rehearsal and training toward the future, i.e. pretending, see, a few pages later, transfer some of my ninja powers to help her understand, in the etymological sense of moving, tending, striving toward, more specifically stretching forth, and parametrically demanding, as in Latin or Italian, pretending, pretendere, versus domandare, demand, as in demanding that other people recognize us as we want to be recognized, regardless and or at times in spite of external and verifiable factors. Of course, everybody has a moral, ethical, social, and legal right to view himself or herself as the best way he or she would like to see himself or herself. However, demanding that others do so could be empirically and experientially inconsistent. Another example, because everyone thinks I'm a girl. Basic example of this would be demanding to be called a teacher without the proper training, experience, and or expertise to do so. Of course, one might argue that the term teacher, similar to the term doctor, could be extended parametrically, metaphorically, and figuratively to define admiration of one's excellence in certain areas, regardless of their recognizable academic training and certification or degrees demonstrating such excellence. Of course, recognizing this excellence is again predicated on the recognition by others, not oneself. In other words, I could claim to be the best psychologist ever, but if nobody else besides me recognizes it, this will make it a mistaken, false claim. Furthermore, even if this excellence were to be recognized by others, the selection process of these other groups, just as in a scientific study design, should be subjected to the same scientific rigor to avoid selection bias in the subject selection itself. In other words, one could not appeal to the excellence for excellence itself, as in the now common saying, eminence-based science is not evidence-based science. Now, these issues may create further confusion in parents who are actually doing their best to find the right group of professionals to help their child. Are we to reject any type of excellence just because it might be predicated on false assumptions? Are we to reject all medical, clinical, scientific, pedagogical training? Of course not. There are multiple situations where an appeal to authority is indeed the best option, particularly when such authority is exercised in areas which entries or to a very big extent foreign to us, to our experiences, and to our training. An example of this would be trusting your surgeon to perform a surgery on your knee. It's an example that I mentioned before. A, because you're not the surgeon yourself and you do not possess the necessary training, clinical experience, and degree or board certification. And B, because the surgeon does not have the same experience as yourself, i.e. he or she does not have to have experienced a similar medical issue in his or her knee or to have had a surgery performed himself for similar reasons. To clarify the second point, a professional does not have to be you to be helpful to you. Read. It doesn't have to be you as in your group, your affiliation, your self-identification, etc. In fact, in many cases, diversity, difference is power. A professional might see problems and medical, clinical, etc. issues which you might be completely unaware of. Of course, any professional could make mistakes, but one would hope that experience, training, and degrees could at least to some important extent vouch for the integrity and ability of such professionals. If this professional is then able to tell a person that what the person perceived as a problem of societal and familial acceptance, as it is claimed through the book, is actually a physical or mental problem, this does not constitute an attack, an offense, or a crime. It is actually a tool predicated on verifiable, scientifically speaking, truths used to help the person. To be more blunt, in clinical settings, calling someone mentally ill, or more probably calling someone as affected by a mental illness, is not different, ethically, morally, and clinically, from calling someone physically ill. The fact that a person, in our case a child, must struggle with certain, in this specific case, sex and gender identity issues, and could be therefore, again, clinically labeled with a mental health disorder, it's not different than calling, as an example, a professional athlete with a knee injury someone with a physical disorder. We do not call the first person crazy or stupid or immoral or evil, etc., just as we don't call the second person weak or faulty or a loser, etc. We should always demonstrate respect, integrity, honesty, love, and tolerance. Let's restate this. If a doctor is labeling something, a person's behavior or emotion, cognitive process, clinical presentation, affect, etc., as mentally ill, the doctor is not saying that the person is bad. Even the most objectively assumed bad behavior, for instance, killing someone or abusing someone, a doctor refrains from calling the person bad in the etymological sense captivus, i.e. prisoner. But we label the behavior as bad. Of course, at times we all get so attached to a relatively small, but prone to increase in size, part of ourselves, such as certain behavior, emotion, thought, that if someone else, even if qualified, calls that clinically ill, from the German übel, it might feel offensive, but it's neither an offense, nor a lie, nor an attack on our identity or self. It's simply a tool for healing. Not telling the truth might actually feel good in the moment. Same page, we will make a plan to tell everyone we love that we know. What is that? That you're a boy. But it will ultimately create far more damage in either the child or the parent or the ill-informed professional who did not address this appropriately could have envisioned. Logically speaking, it would be the same as saying a person, if this feels good to you, it must be good for you. Of course, to some extent, we are our best therapists because being an expert means having had an experience, and we are the only ones living in our bodies since birth, metaphysical assumption aside. However, everything about us can get sick, including our self-perception, proprioception, minds, and bodies. This is why someone affected by diabetes mellitus might be told not to eat not to eat yet another piece of chocolate cake, despite the fact that it would feel so good to have another one. What might be partially harmful at first could become life-threatening. And because of that, we should also not necessarily expect, wish, or want any doctor telling us how we should live our lives in terms of assimilating, flattening our true self to be just like everybody else, as far too often group identity policies do with the pretense of helping people. Because we are indeed beautiful in our uniqueness. This is precisely why we should be free to be us. I should be free to be me. This means that a caring, inclusive, well-trained, helpful, open-minded, nurturing professional should help me realize the beauty that is me, not telling me or agreeing with me if that's what I want, I believe at that stage. Or agreeing with me if that's what I believe at that stage, then I will feel better if someone's something different than me. This is not only not helpful, it could be extremely dangerous. One of the examples that I sadly encounter in some very hurt, broken, suffering patients, this time I'm talking about my psychological practice, at the beginning of their therapy, is their full wish to die, to disappear from this world, to fade away in nothingness. If I try, and I most certainly do, as it is both the right, ethical, professional, and moral thing to do, to convince them otherwise, they often perceive this as an attack, not dissimilarly from what one could call hate speech or infringement on personal liberty. Again, do not tell me how to live or end my life. My body, my choice, including mind, spirit, identity, etc. Yeah, sure it is, but as many other choices, it could be misinformed, mistaken, confused, hurt, suffering. My job and my moral obligation is to go against what these patients might define as their true self at that moment and push them gently, openly, lovingly, beyond what they can see as a possibility at the time. Their very sense of self, their whole identity is mistaken. I should not simply agree with them to make them feel better in the moment, because this won't be the truth, it won't last, and it's not what they need. And this again is a central issue. We confuse what we want with what we need. We confuse healing with relief. And this happens far more often, more intensely, plenty of scientific literature in this area, when we are suffering. And even more so if we do not want to admit to ourselves that we are suffering. And that one of the things we think could ease our suffering is actually making the suffering worse. It is the very nature of addiction. Confusing wants with needs has this effect. Telling someone that they are what they feel or think or behave as, emotion, cognition, behavior, try it, they are, or what they pretend, again in a strictly etymological clinical sense, they are not, is not healing, is relief. And that is precisely why we should honor our teachers much, much, much more than we do in our society. Schools are indeed the extension of our family, in the best possible sense of the term, and teachers should be mentors, guides, because they're wonderful in what they do. They should make our children whole, which, etymologically speaking, is connected to healthy and even holy. Children should thus be accompanied, stimulated in a way to extract beauty and wisdom from them, Latin educare. Not the other way around, which is what the books describe as optimal. Well, Penelope, today you're my teacher. This is one of the most problematic parts of the book. It is meant as nice, tolerant, generous, and warm way to see how truly wonderful and smart and empowered and sensitive and strong our children are, which is itself a true and great thing. But it's actually putting enormous pressure. We are not talking about proper alternative pedagogical modalities such as Montessori or Steiner, other schools. I used to be an elementary school teacher back in the day, and I still admire many aspects of their pedagogy. On those children who seek at times, without being aware of this need, education, guidance, and role models. To utilize the same medical analogy, it would be actually disheartening to see a surgeon telling a child in the operating room, well, Penelope, today you're my surgeon. Of course, children also learn by play, role play, and make believe, and we should certainly allow them to help us in our jobs when the situation is appropriate and safe. But there should always be a distinction between the person who does not yet have full mastery of the topic, even more so if the topic is so complex as one's identity, and the one who does. Plus, if we have such a huge respect and admiration for people like doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists included, who only see children on a less regular basis to address clinical issues, shouldn't we have even more respect and admiration for our teachers, who literally see our children every day and have them grow, develop, and become who they really are? And again, just as the scientific literature is extremely clear about the fact that there is a wonderful, incredibly complex variation between how a man can be a man and a woman can be a woman, in this case, biology really does not like behavioral stereotyping and closed-mindedness. It's also extremely clear how pretending that just because an individual might feel differently or completely opposed to what a certain society claims is the proper behavior for their own sex, this does not warrant the person having to be another sex. I would say, or a third sex, or a fourth, or a fifth. This aspect is at the center of the very last 2 pages of the book, where throughout the narration the ninja value of quote-unquote masculine strength is admired, and despite the fact that this type of stereotyping could be harmful, Penelope still has to bow to the fact that in order to be recognized as who she is, not being socially transparent, she has to act, again in the clinical sense of behavioral activation, as the opposite sex. 2 things come to mind in this context. The first one, also a well-known fact in the research of at least 50 years, is the fact that if we were to divide children into 3 categories, first, children who are not liked or hated by our classmates, 2 children that are liked or loved, 3 children who are neither liked or hated, categories 1 and 2 are often predictors of much better psychological outcomes than category 3. Rather than using harsh and unscientific terms such as the child is only looking for attention, that's why he or she is acting differently from the norm, we should actually truly understand what this means, i.e., children want attention. We need to make sure that the attention they want is the one they need. The other issues is a much more complex one, though it is relatively easy to solve with the proper knowledge of neuropsychological aspects in conjunction to basic knowledge of historical and possibly developmental linguistics. Is the issue of sex versus gender. And again, this is a very brief summary, all right? I would be more than happy to address this one in a different section, although let me also point out that the artificially constructed separation between these terms, together with a wide array of neologisms and derived adjectivization, is a phenomenon which does not find solid evidence beyond certain poetic constructions. In truth, poetry and arts in general can actually tell us much more profound things about ourselves than a laboratory exploration. However, to see the very biological origin of the term gender rooted purely Indo-European etymology through gene, gene, coming to the Greek genetikos, just as in genetics, genes, geno, genitalia, but also genesis, gynecology, and even the very word for the creative sex, i.e. women, gunaika, Greek, genam, Bosnian, Croatian or Serbian, etc. Rather than trying to destroy the very origin and create part of the term gender, we should honor the very being who is the embodiment of creation itself, women. In this sense, gender is not only extremely related to the term sex, but is actually the very synonym in the area of mechanical physical activation or activity. In other words, pun intended, if the dictionary definition of sex is gender or a state of being either male or female, the root is through the Latin sexus, itself connected with dividing, separating, cutting, same etymology as C-section, both as in the C of Caesarean, and in the very term section, which has nothing to do with the Caesar Augustus, itself connected, according to more scholars, to either ticto, same meaning as above, that's procreation, generation, or excess, or condition, state, as in stato di gravidanza, for pregnancy. Therefore, adding any other socially constructed or otherwise, although the latter begs the question, constructed by whom except someone in some type of society, the scriptures such as identity, behavior, expression, etc., can help distinguish certain aspects of the way sex and gender manifests itself inwardly and outwardly, just the same way as the concept of being green is distinguishable from greenness itself, and yet one cannot exist without, and it's entirely defined by the other. Green can be a tree, a leaf, a book, a shirt, or the most beautiful green mountain state. In any case, as evidenced above, adding more to scripture does not change the ontological or, to remain grounded in the ground, as in material reality, biological nature of the concept and its manifestation or epiphany in such reality. I just want to add something here that's not contained in the letter. One of the issues is that some people might feel the need of removing the very association between gender and sex because of what is perceived as sexism throughout history. Now, we already demonstrated how this is really an oxymoron given the false pretense of transgender ideology ultimately hurts women. But even if this were to be the case, where there would be an assumption of patriarchal hatred that is found in the very words we use every day, where everything that's male is good and everything that's female is bad, this is actually a false statement. It's not true. It doesn't have any historical basis. In fact, there's plenty of research, and some research I've conducted myself with, thanks to the cooperation of wonderful linguists. But the gender issue might actually take on a very different and even opposite trait. Think about what's happening in other languages. In German, for instance, where everything has to be gender-based to make it even more binary. So all words that were masculine, and by masculine we simply mean all-encompassing, neutral, such as Handwerker, for instance, that has to become Handwerkerin for the female one. It's actually the opposite of the transgender ideology is doing. By the way, if it is true that etymologically speaking appears to be the fact that the male term is a standard term and the female is the added term, such as doctor, doctress, dottore, dottoressa, actor, actress, attore, attrice, etc. Biologically speaking, the standard sex is actually feminine. So if one were to really follow science, if there is a hierarchy, it's actually a female-dominated hierarchy, not male-dominated hierarchy. Of course, nobody will really have to argue against biology, because you cannot claim that this is necessarily a bad thing, because thankfully the stronger genes is the gene that is associated with women, because women are the ones carrying babies, and women are the ones who need to be stronger in the lifespan, and men also are the ones that usually conduct a more dangerous lifestyle, they die sooner, there are less of them overall, and generally speaking, this makes a lot of sense. But even if we want to stay in the realm of linguistics, think about terms such as feminism and machismo, where the first one is usually considered a good thing, a tolerant, a progressive, democratic term, and being a macho is considered backward and bad, despite the fact that feminism comes from women and machismo comes from men. But the man part is considered a priori a negative thing. Another thing is really, really fun, which is an absurd pseudo-etymological claim, is to say that female is really an addendum to male, so that it's due to this male-dominant hierarchy, where the true person is a male and female is an addendum. Now, if you have basic knowledge of Latin, you will know that female comes from feminella, which is a Latin term derived from femina, not from male plus fe. It's just completely bogus. You can make the case for a variety of things, including man versus mensch for human beings, or even woman, because, you know, I heard this before. Well, woman is really an addendum to men, because men want to dominate the discourse, and therefore the W always is just an addendum. Well, etymologically speaking, this is absolutely absurd. At first, it might look like that, because woman comes from wife man, as in the wife of the man. But in turn, the wife comes from vibe, which is itself woman. We say that in Tarot too. We say vibe, vibe for the plural form. So it's completely unscientific from all perspectives. Anyway, let's continue. Book 3, Jacob Newdress. Our analysis of this book will be the shortest, as most of the issues presented herein are substantially equivalent, in some cases fully superimposable to the ones known in the previous 2 books. In fact, most of the narrative focus on what most professionals and parents will simply define as within standard normal behavior in children. And yet again, we are faced with the false premise that there is something narrowing, controlling, choking, moralizing, dehumanizing, labeling, ostracizing, or at least not individualistic, special about normality. Here again, the right versus left-wing political spectrum. The main character in the book struggles and succeeds in finding the repressive nature of what normal society imposes on Jacob, despite the fact that society, which is quite similar from a psychological standpoint to certain conspiracy-prone descriptors such as "they don't want you to know," and similar, keeps trying to imprison Jacob into something he is not. Of course, all the topoi or standard literary narrative techniques are present, including the opponent, adversary, bad guy Christopher, notice the name, who behaves as, yet again, the normal society-expected bad kid. To continue in our conspiracy theory version of the facts, it's quite amusing to see how the Christ bearer, as we mentioned earlier from dysphoria, right, Christophoros, is opposed in the very next page by the Black Witch Drax Jacob, just as in the best Netflix narratives, making fun of the main character on Netflix. As expected, both mom and dad are surprised and puzzled by their son's behavior. We would argue to an extent that goes far beyond normal parental concern regarding dress codes, especially because the book clearly claims, as in other examples above, to be against gender stereotyping, and yet fails to notice how the bad character relates to all the stereotypically male things, armor, dinosaur, etc., while the good character to all the stereotypically female things. This is nothing new, as it's simply the story of the previous book in a binary reverse modality, except that the novelty in this book is to add some pseudo-historical, unscientific claims about societal norms which were predictors of this stereotyping. Oxymorons aside, and there are plenty for all this in volume, sentences such as, "not very long ago little girls couldn't wear pants," are seemingly applicable to such a minute part of history, something less than 185 years in a 5,000 years of Indo-European anthropological clothing and costume research, where one of the most clear examples of such fallible assumptions is the difference between Greco-Roman culture and, to some extent, for Crescent, Unani, Perso-Berber, Arab, and by extension Proto-Semitic and Canaanite culture, and the proclivity for tunic and long dresses in juxtaposition to what we know from research on Germano-Celtic and, to some extent, Slavic, Thracian, and Illyrian cultures, to name a few, and their preference for pants. This part of the book is not too different from the embarrassing moments of certain claims made in the media, I won't mention the name in this setting, that neckties were signs of British imperialism, despite the fact that they originate in the Dalmatian part of Croatia, hence the name cravatta, as basis for most European and non-European languages, including Italian cravatta, by the way, throughout the Republic of Venice, which was present in Dalmatia at the time. Or the fact that blue jeans are representative of US supremacy, despite the fact that even the very name of this item defines origins. Gene is of Genova in the Italian Liguria, so the genes are the people of Genova, the Genovese. People seem to ignore how this garment represents the most autochthonous folklore piece of ethnic tribal clothing in that part of the world. Of course, the fact that Genova was the city of Columbus and the fact that he might have been a Marrano does not help the narrative. Again, mom and dad are not depicted as necessarily bad, just unaware, uneducated. See again this supremacist assumption that we discussed earlier. They do their best to make sense of the situation, but yet again the mistake, or rather the author is the culprit in this sense, a psychosomatized confusion between trigger and trauma, between healing and relief, and they attribute the suspension of phenomenological symptomatology, i.e. Jacob has difficulty breathing, as an indication that they have to change their attitude toward things. Finally, a nice addendum to the recipe comes from the usual neologisms such as interesting, and the grand finale with the confusion between plot and the absence of a moral of the story. With Christopher yelling that because Jacob wears female clothes, he is now part of the girls' team. Again, the reader is generally accompanied into believing that this is an offensive statement, a mild form of hate speech, an oxymoron in itself, but the truth is precisely the message of the book. The identical essence in ontological terms between an extracted display behavior and identification of the stereotypical owner of the behavior with a new identity of conditioned, society-induced, subconscious, they still present the masculine archetype of the armor at its binary opposite, i.e. a soft, cottony, magic armor, of which the main character is proud of. Again, there's a whole body of literature, not just in social science and natural science, but also in historical narrative and exegesis about the dangers of the conceptualization of pride. But we'll leave this aside for now. A perfect script. For an adult novel. For children, we would rather see more pedagogically sound literature. It is not my role to go out and tell other families what to think about this issue, but it's definitely my ethical and moral requirement to shed light on the false pretense that certain pseudoscientific claims have had in order to protect our children, in order to protect our society, and in order to do what we said was the main goal, and I hope I was able to deliver that throughout this discussion, namely to promote love, tolerance, awareness, and care for fellow human beings. Thank you very much.